Video games are unique as a storytelling medium in that they do not have to tell just one story. Now that is to say, a book or movie never changes from one viewing to the next. We as the audience may change, and we may find new insight or criticism to the story, but the story itself plays out exactly the same every time. And this is not necessarily true or even desirable in a video game. Because of the depth and variety a game can offer over another medium, such as a book or a movie, games have many other narrative options. These include games that have more than one narrative, games that change the story based on the player actions or decisions in the game, and games that allow players to make up their own stories. So what is a linear narrative? A linear narrative means that the story will be told from start to finish, and it will never vary in its delivery of plot points. Many games with linear narratives will also have linear game design. For these types of games, the story is meant to accentuate the gameplay, but not necessarily be a crucial part of it. The story helps fill in the details to push some level of immersion, but the goals of the player are not affected by knowing the story. Whether they follow the story or not, they will still play the game in the same way. Now the story may make them enjoy the game a little bit more, or perhaps less if the story is bad, but it doesn't matter in terms of completing the game. This does not mean the story must be trivial or small. Linear narratives can create amazing stories within games. They just don't necessarily affect gameplay. Halo, for example, has a fairly detailed and engaging story, but is entirely optional for the player to follow along or not. Not following along the story in Halo does not stop the player from moving through the game just fine. And at the same time, following the story doesn't give the player any actual gameplay help. The story doesn't open up any levels for the player or give any type of clues to play the game better. The story in Halo is entirely optional. However, the story does add a sense of immersion and world detail that adds to the game. For other games with linear narratives, the story is linked to gameplay. As the player plays the game, the story advances. There's really no deviating from the story being told, and in fact, the player must often watch cutscenes so the writers can give exposition on the story they want to tell. In these kinds of games, there's nothing the player can do to change the story. The whole point of playing the game is to slowly reveal predetermined story points. Now the player helps the main character achieve their goals, but the goals are always the same. The difference is that the story is more integrated into the gaming experience. That is to say, the player needs to follow the story in order to understand what is happening in the game. Often there are quests involved that advances the narrative. Again, many fantasy role-playing games use this sort of narrative. The story must be compelling or the gameplay feels flat. The story must be followed or the context of the player's action and goals are lost. So unlike Halo, where the player can pick up at any level and comprehend enough to know what to do, this type of linear narrative requires some attention to detail of the plot points. So what's a branching narrative? Well, games that utilize branching narratives offer a little more to players in terms of story variation. Branching narratives mean that players are offered some choice that will change some aspect of the story being told. This is done through creating multiple separate paths for the player to take that moves them through one story or another. It is a digital fork in the road, where one direction is a completely different story than the other. Sometimes when a road is chosen, it is irreversible. The other path becomes blocked off permanently unless the player starts over and chooses the other path when they reach that point in the game again. This cutoff is often done for story reasons. To allow both paths would create story contradictions. For example, the player may be offered a chance to save a town from a wizard or join the wizard in turning everyone into frogs. Once the player chooses one of those options, the other option is no longer available to them. So there is still some obvious game engineering going on in the player's head as they witness these branching narratives. That is to say, they can imagine where each choice leads and make some conscious decision on how they want to play the game. However, this implies that they care. Again, story is important. If the choices and decisions seem forced, cliched, or uninteresting, then they have failed as a feature of the game. These choices must also be balanced. If one path leads to an immediate game over situation, and the other leads to hours of fun and engagement, then there's a serious problem with the branching narratives in that game. Once again, storytelling in games needs to be more than great plot and structure. It needs to work within the game itself. Finally, branching narratives are going to take much more time and planning in the design stage of the pre-production of development than a linear narrative. This is because there is so much more complexity in the design and the material to be utilized. Now, some games do not have a structured narrative, but instead have an implied narrative. This means that the game simply presents a world to explore without any or very few story elements beyond interacting with the world. What makes this kind of game work, typically, is that it is built to be a massive multiplayer online game, or an MMO, where lots of people share the world and have an implied narrative amongst themselves. That is, each player creates stories in the game that are unique to themselves and the way they play the game. Consider simulations like The Sims. These worlds offer players things to do, but no real storylines to follow. However, there are a few to no restrictions on how a player chooses to explore the world, and their experience in the world will be completely unique for them. This is because they will interact with perhaps hundreds of other players that fill their own character dialogue with unpredictable statements in real time. Of course, no amount of dialogue planning can achieve this level of diversity and variation. So, on a plus side, players form their own motivations for playing in the world, mostly based off their ability to play completely freeform. This freeform style play then generates its own storylines depending on what the players decide they want to do. On a negative side, this type of game requires lots of diverse players to generate story content. From a game designer point of view, to achieve this type of narrative, the game must present a lot of activities for players to do, and these activities must in some way define who they are in the game. From there, the player interactions and imagination take over. Again, this is a much different style of game than one with an intended narrative.